Hello and welcome to Fantasy Fiction Focus once again. Our guest today from Toronto is Angela Misri. Hello, how are you?
I am well, thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good, thank you. Now, you are the author of these very exciting adventures of Portia Adams, a very famous detective, I believe. So I would like you to immediately tell us all about this detective from the 1930s that you invented.
I'd love to. So Portia Adams is a 19-year-old Canadian girl who lives in the 1930s. She lives in Toronto, and she loses her mother at the beginning of my first book. And in the reading of her mother's will, she discovers two really important things. She discovers that she's inherited 221 Baker Street in London, and that she has a new guardian she's never met before. And these two things launch her into this new world. She leaves for London almost immediately because she has nothing holding her in Toronto at that point, and discovers that she is related to the past owners of 221 Baker Street, which are the most famous detective offices in the world, the offices of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. So she spends the first book trying to figure out how she's related, how she knew nothing about this lineage, where this all comes from, why her mother hid it from her, all those things. And that's the entirety of the first book, is how she figures out how she's related to these offices and to the men who work there. And the second book is called Thrice Burned and came out last year. And it is an exploration of whether she wants to become a detective as well. Because she's inherited these offices, does that mean she should be a consulting detective as well? So she spends the second book kind of figuring it out, dealing with a lot of insecurity because she's 19 and she's a Canadian girl living in London in 1930, and there's a limited amount of freedom you can have as a woman in that time. It's more than you had in the early 1900s, and certainly more than when Sherlock Holmes was around, but it's not what we would have today. So it's not as easy for her to just take up the reins. So she spends the second book figuring out if she can do this, figuring out if she wants to do this. And then the third book, which comes out in March of this year, is about her really standing alone as a detective at Baker Street.
Oh, I see. So now, obviously, one of my first questions, I suppose, would be Sherlock Holmes. I always think of Sherlock Holmes as being Victorian or certainly pre-1914, as an editor. So why would you have, obviously she's a descendant or something, but why did you decide to set this type of story in the 30s instead of what is, a very popular era with the steampunk people and everything? The turn of the century is more popular. Why would you have gone with the 30s? Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, so 1895 is like the Sherlock Holmes and Watson. It's like the golden ages of Sherlock Holmes and Watson. And I love reading about stories in that time for the same reasons that you named. It's a fantastic time to write about, fantastic time to read about. The 1930s is a time between the two great wars. And it's a fascinating time to be a woman in what they are gaining, the kind of ground they're gaining. Like even from the simplicity of wearing trousers for the first time, that was in the 1930s, to being able to be a member of parliament in London or in Canada. Those things were possible in the 1930s where it wasn't possible in the 20s and earlier. But it is also a time, it's like the suffragette time, right? It's like a really tumultuous women changing the world time, at least in the Western world, that I find fascinating to write about. And that's why I decided, it was the first thing I decided when I started writing these books, that I was going to write in the 1930s. And then I worked backwards and tried to figure out how she could be related to Watson and Holmes based on her being alive in the 1930s.
All right. Now, I'm assuming then with that there will be more adventures for her. You've got a third one coming out very soon. It's sort of in the spring of 2016. Will you be doing more, do you think?
Yes, so the fourth book is set in Toronto. I've already started writing it. So she's going to come back to Toronto to solve a case. In my head, I'm working all the way to the Second World War. I really want her to be a participant in the Second World War, and I'm trying to figure out what would be possible for her to be doing in the Second World War that would be believable, but at the same time kind of push boundaries.
Well, yeah, she's going to be the right age for that, I suppose. She's a 19 or early 20s. She could certainly do that. She's got a good 20 years to have adventures and things like that. Yeah. So now, obviously, you are in Toronto, and we were chatting earlier. You did live in the UK until you were about 5 or 6 years old. So you've got that connection with both countries. But so, did you want to? In the first three books, it sounds like she's a Canadian in London. and doesn't come back for adventures until the fourth one to Canada. So why would you not have just had this character be English and British and be in London rather than being Canadian? Is it just because of your own background?
Yeah, so a lot of people have pointed that out to me, and the reason was I wanted to be able to write something I knew. Right, and I am an English girl who lived in Canada most of her life. So I left London obviously when I was 6. So I know Canada really well. I know what it's like to be a fish out of water because I moved here. So I really wanted her to have that added tension of the fish out of water, right? So she's already a woman trying to be a detective in a world that doesn't really allow women detectives. She's already 19 years old and kind of pushing the boundaries of what you do at 19 when you're a woman, which is essentially get married. And then to add that extra tension level of Canadian moving back to London and knowing nothing about London, essentially, I really found fascinating. So that's the reason that I kept her Canadian. I also really wanted to make sure that she wasn't constrained by mores in London. She's sort of constrained by the mores of Canada, but Canada was a different place. It was colonial. It was a lot more open. Even if you were not actually, encouraged to go to school, it wasn't fought as hard as it was in London. There was a lot of really strong cultural barriers in London. While in Canada, she comes from Canada and she goes, well, yeah, of course I can do this, right? She comes in with the assumption that I can do this. So I wanted her to have that kind of background. I would have set some of the stories earlier in Toronto, but I decided she really needed a strong grounding in what 221 Baker Street was. To really get that sense so that she has that gravitas by the time she comes back to Toronto to do a case.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say that. You've obviously established that before she's going to come back to do that. Now, when did the first one come out?
March 2014.
Right, so it's quite recent then in that sense. So were you writing before? I know you've got some other background in journalism and things we don't want to come to, but were you writing books as a teenager or something like that? I mean, what's your sort of writing background for fiction?
Right. So I think like everyone else, I have a book that I wrote when I was 20 that is sitting in a drawer somewhere and that I haven't reopened since then. It's one of those books that is like, really close to my heart, but I'm scared to reopen just in case it's crap. And I don't want to confront that. I currently believe it's the best book I've ever written, and I just can't touch it right now. So yes, I was writing very early on. I was first published when I was 13. In an anthology, one of those anthologies that schools in Alberta puts together. It's a story I tell all the time because I was on the track, I'm Asian, I was on the track to be a doctor because that's what you do. You either become an engineer or you become a doctor, and that was the track I was on for a lot of my life. When I was 13, I was at an assembly with all my friends, and we're sitting there gabbing away, not paying attention to what's happening up on the stage. And the principal calls out my name. And I was just like, oh God, what did I do? What happened? Like, I'm not paying attention. I get up there and he hands me a huge anthology, like a coil bound anthology. And he says, congratulations. And I was just like, what? And it turns out one of the poems that I'd written for my English class had been published. And that was my first mind-blowing idea that I could do this. And that changed my life. I went home and I told my parents I was going to be a writer. And my parents were like, oh, come on, don't be silly. You're not going to do that. It's fine. You're going to go be a doctor and you can write medical textbooks. It'll be great. And so I spent the next few years doing the medical thing. I took the MCAT, I did pre-med, I did the whole thing. And I had to take a required course at U of C, University of Calgary. I had to take a required course in English. And when I finished that course, my teacher took me aside and said, I know what you're trying to do, but you're a writer. You should stop this and just go do this. This is what you should be doing with your life. And that's what finally convinced my parents to let me do more writing. So yes, I've been writing for a long time, even though I didn't know I was going to be a writer for a long time. When I was at CBC, which is where I worked for 15 years, because I'm a journalist, what happened was I got promoted into management. Probably in the last 3 years of my career there. And what I discovered is once I stopped producing creative content, like when I stopped creating radio, when I stopped creating websites, there was this thing in me that I needed to create something. I was starting to feel really constrained. So I was doing management all day long, not actually touching anything creative. And I'd get on the subway on the TTC and I would write books after books on the subway, standing there jostling for elbow room, writing by hand. And I filled 33 moleskin notebooks in 3 years. And my husband finally said to me, I think this is more than a hobby. You should probably publish this stuff. And that's how it happened. I sent out the books to be published, and within 3 months, I found a publisher.
Now, these books on the subway, just out of interest, because I've done similar, not on the subway, I've done lots of, I've still got lots of folders with handwritten notes in them. Sometimes I type them up and they're just little ideas and they're in the computer. Were the Portia Adams stories amongst these that you were writing on the train?
Yep. I wrote the first 3 books in those 3 years.
By hand on a train?
Yep.
Oh, my goodness me.
One after the other.
Wow, that's an amazing story, actually. It really is. So you obviously got the new book coming out, and one planned after that. Now, as well as obviously you do journalism and you do some teaching and things as well, and web projects for people. But do you have any other fiction project, any other novel subjects, or are you going to stick with Portia for a while?
I'm writing a contemporary mystery called Kono MacLeod, which is about a digital journalist. So again, calling from my own life. She's 25, and it's kind of like a Dan Brown mystery. It's like a very adventurous run through the city kind of thing. So I've got that one on the go. I have a 5-part series I'm doing with 4 other authors, which is going to be middle grade. And it's about reincarnation, which is going to be interesting. And then I have I write science fiction novels as well, and I self-publish those ones under my pseudonym, Kit Cole. So I write those as well. So I have a few on the go.
So just tell me again, what's that thing? You're writing this series with other authors. What's that about?
So it's a middle grade series, and so 4 other authors that I've asked to join me on this. And what it is it's going to be a quest story. So it's going to be that this person is reincarnated 5 different times in 5 different eras to find a quest item each time to build to the end when he will solve the quest. So that's the concept. So I'm writing the last story, which is the solution of the entire long-winded quest. But I have someone writing about the First World War. I have someone writing about Egyptians. I have someone writing about the Wild West, and someone writing about the Middle Ages.
Now, is that going to be self-published, or is there a publisher involved in that?
We have an agent who's currently shopping it around, so we'll see.
So now, the Portia Adams story, are they self-published, or
no.
Is somebody else? Okay, who is the publisher of that?
Fierce Ink Press in Canada, out of Halifax, is my Canadian publisher, and my agent's looking for a U.S. publisher.
All right. So why did you go with the self-publishing thing for the other one?
Quite frankly, the science fiction, I felt that medium was very ebook friendly. Like, I read most of my science fiction novels on ebooks, so I felt like it was a really good space to try to publish. And it's doing really well. It's sold over, I think, 1,500 copies in 2 years, so that's pretty good. So I just felt the medium was right for it, and I also felt like I can churn out sci-fi at a rate that I don't churn out detective fiction. I don't know why. Science fiction seems to flow right out of me. Detective fiction takes me a lot more time to write. So traditional publishers so far for detective fiction and sci-fi has all been done self-published.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Sometimes I can churn out things quite quickly, depending on what it is. I mean, if it's science and technology story set in the contemporary present day, I can do something in 2 or 3 months easily for this age group that I'm doing. But if it's historical, especially historical.
Yeah.
Things. And I suppose detective is the same. There's a lot more research, a lot more thought has to go into it, I suppose.
There's just a lot of clues to check into. It's a lot of logic to make sure it works out. Then I run it past a lot of people. So Thrice Burned, obviously by the title you can tell, has arson in it. So I ran that past some firefighters. I ran it past some arson experts at the police department. It's a lot more fact-checking to me, while sci-fi is you're building the world, right? So you're in control of all the logic. As long as you're consistent with your logic, there's really no one to check with.
Right, I think you're right as well that certain things are. I've talked about this before on this particular channel and on other groups. Certain media, certain genres seem to be good for ebooks only, and science fiction, horror, adult fantasy, romance as well, of course, and I suppose murder mystery type stuff. The sort of book I always think it's more like the sort of books that people buy at airport bookshops for the plane ride.
Yeah, the ones that you can just ingest so quickly, go right through them.
And I think a young adult fiction is not as popular in ebooks yet. It might be, but it's very slow to build, and middle grade certainly not. It doesn't seem to be. Yeah, self-help books as well sometimes are good, big on that. So now you're teaching as well. Like you're teaching at Ryerson in Toronto as
Yes.
well. What do you do there?
I teach digital journalism at Ryerson, and I'm building a couple of courses for U of Toronto in digital journalism.
So nothing to do with creative writing for detective stories.
I'd love to. I keep trying to put my hat in the ring to teach some creative writing courses. So far, I think I'm just not senior enough to get those courses. There's a lot of writers out there with way more years of experience.
Well, are you pitching it as being a how to write detective fiction or just creative writing?
I pitched both. I pitched creative writing, mystery writing, historical fiction writing, women in detective fiction. I'll try anything once.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I pitched a few. I pitched a historical fiction one here, and it didn't. We tried it a couple of times. Didn't get enough people. We did get some people, and writing for children and young adults. I've done that quite a few times. It's got to be something that appeals to people. You've got to get people to register. So that's the main thing. Now,
well, the other thing is I'm up against such people as Terry Fallis and like Farzana Doctor here in Toronto, right? Like they've got some big name authors who are willing to teach those courses.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, that you've got to be you're up against those people. So, but one day you'll be just as successful.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you.
Absolutely, because I mean, let's be honest. You are going to the TD Children's Book Week tour in Canada in 2016, I believe.
Yes, with you as well. I'm very excited.
Well, we're not in the same city, unfortunately. We're on the same website. We're traveling together digitally on the same website. But you're going to well, actually, before you go, but just tell them, what is Children's Book Week?
So this is run by TD and Canadian Children's Book Centre, and every year they pick 20 to 25 authors out of a list of people who apply that they will send to a new city outside of your home province, and they will arrange for a whole bunch of school visits, library visits, that kind of thing over that week. So I think this week this year it's May 7 to 15th, I think, is the dates. So they're sending me to Winnipeg, they're sending you to Montreal, and we're going to get exposed to a whole bunch of students that we wouldn't normally have access to, which is like a dream come true for me.
And of course, books will be sold at your events, and hopefully, in your case, that schools will buy your books to the library, and the bookstores will have them on the shelf, and there'll be some residual publicity that'll keep the books moving, and hopefully be a launch for you to move on. That's the whole plan. Yeah. So do you do a lot of marketing yourself, and book appearances and book signings and things like that locally?
I do. I'm really lucky because I have that Sherlockian I guess fan base, you'd call it. So I get invited to a lot of Sherlockian conferences. I've been to Comic-Con, I've been to 221B Con, Gridlock DC. I've been a keynote speaker at a few of the local Sherlock chapters. So I'm really lucky to have that fan base because they'll read anything about Sherlock that's good. And thankfully my book has passed muster. So I have that huge base of people behind me who are not YA readers at all. They just love Sherlock, right? So they'll read anything about 221B. So I've got that, plus word on the street, and I've had really good success with Indigo chapters for some reason. I'm not questioning it, knock on wood. Like, they'll invite me. In December, I was there in an Indigo chapters every single week in December. So it was good.
Yeah, I do stuff locally. I don't do anything in December. They don't like us to do stuff in December here because they're too busy. And January, I just avoid personally. It's too quiet. But mid-February, I'm back on the circuit locally at about 3 or 4 local stores. And sometimes I do. I don't know. It depends what you want. I do well at some of them, and sometimes I get rid of a lot of business cards, and that is good for school visits and other work, editing other people's books and things like that. So
in Calgary, I've been to Monkey Shines and done a pretty fun event there. Have you been to Monkey Shines?
Yes, but not for a while. But as long as I think you have to be out there and market your books, I suppose.
Yeah.
Now, so do you have any advice for other writers? Obviously, you've self-published, you've had a regular publisher, you've done teaching and things and all sorts of stuff, and quite a lot of experience. Do you have any advice for people who are maybe just starting out and wondering what the writing life and the career might be?
Okay, so yes, I do. My first piece of advice is not to be discouraged. My first 36 replies for my publishing to try to get my Portia Adams books out there were 36 rejections. My 37th, my 38th, and 39th were all acceptance letters from publishers. So what I would say is keep going at it. I had a rule that one of my author friends told me very early on. She said, for every rejection letter you get, send out 2 more query letters. Just keep that active, like just keep doing it. Because it's not about you. It's often not about your writing. It's about timing. It's about what they have on their shelf already for this year. So don't be discouraged. Keep putting stuff out there. Somebody will connect with you the right way. So that's my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice is for people who are already published, like people like us who've already, been lucky enough to be published. I would say that you have to keep marketing your books. It's something you know well, Simon, is that you can't just sit on your laurels and hope people are going to remember your book, or hope that, a talk you did 2 years ago is going to resonate with someone 2 years later. You have to keep poking the bear. You have to keep talking about your work. You have to be not humble. You have to try. I know authors are mostly really humble, really quiet people, but you've got to be willing to talk about your work. You've got to introduce yourself to people. When you go to a Chapters to buy a book, which I do once in a while, usually I'm an indie author person, but when you go in, ask for their marketing person, ask for their events coordinator, just find out, make the moves, because it's just not going to happen without you. The days of big publicity engines being behind you are gone. It's you. You're the publicity engine. So that's my 2 pieces of advice.
Yeah, I've mentioned that to people too at the classes I teach at the university and everything. I do make sure to mention these big letters in the notes. I say, look, if you're going to be doing this, if you are completely adamant that you do not wish to be doing book signings yet, or maybe you're saying, I don't want to have a website, or I don't like Facebook and things. Well, I'm sorry, but you have to be out there doing that stuff, unless of course your book is extremely famous and it's became a TV show or a movie. Yeah, fine, that's fine. But for the most of us, yeah, you got to be, and it's not that bad, is it? It's quite enjoyable, isn't it?
It is for us, but I think we're not introverts. So I think people who have trouble with it are the people who never intended this to be part of their career. They intended to write a book. They didn't intend to travel to Comic-Con. But what I will point out to them is, this always reminds me of, when I go to Comic-Con, I always try to find the Walking Dead booth or the Supernatural booth, because those are of interest to me. Why do you think those famous actors are at Comic-Con? They understand that the only way to keep people and fans watching is to keep reminding them, keep poking the bear. So if they're famous and making millions of dollars and they're still at Comic-Con, you can be there too. You should be there.
So you do the Comic-Con thing in Toronto. When is that?
It's in September this year, I think. August or September.
Yeah, we do the one here. It's I have a booth that I share with some other people, and it's end of April, and of course it's huge. Of course, now here it's about 100,000 people more go through it, and I sell books and everything else. And unless it turns out to be not as good for me personally 1 year, I'll keep doing it. I think it's certainly worthwhile.
Well, I'm totally spoiled because I would go to Comic-Con as a fan. I love going to Comic-Con as an author and a fan, because then I spend the rest of the time wandering around getting my signatures from everybody I adore.
Now, I noticed on your website you do there's a study guide for the first book, and I'm assuming that there'll be study guides later for other people. Now, just for people who don't know, what is a study guide?
Yeah, so my teacher's guide is so that you can, as a teacher or a librarian, take my books and insert them into your curriculum is essentially what I've done them for. So there's themes and there's broken out historical things that you can refer to. So let's say you have a module that you want to talk about women and suffragettes and how they got the vote. Well, I have an entire section in the teacher's guide talking about the significance of the 1930s and what headway was made in that area. So it's a teacher's guide specific to bringing it to your classroom, fitting it into your curriculum. It's being taught, the Jewel of the Thames is being taught in 4 schools in Toronto and 2 schools in Edmonton. So it's getting out there, and the teacher's guide I'm getting a lot of good feedback on. I actually had a question for you. It's a series, so I don't know if I should do another teacher's guide for book 2. What do you think?
Well, if the study guide you have is related to the entire series, then no. But I mean, the study guide you already have is related to book 1. There isn't a study guide for book 2. Yeah, but the problem is, perhaps, would you have enough material to fill book 2? If you're covering the role of women, suffragettes, and the general culture of the 30s for women is probably what has got the schools interested for helping girls who are growing up. You might not have enough material to do a second one. But is the study guide an ebook?
It's a PDF.
Right, so you can revise it. You can scrap it and revise it, and when you've got 2 books out, you can do it again. Yeah. So yeah, it's a case of if you've got enough material. I mean, I've not got study guides, but I just wondered if it was worthwhile for you to do that. It sounds like it is. Do you visit schools to promote your work, talking about it, presentations and things?
I probably go to 2 schools a month these days to visit. I actually did a really cool workshop with a grade 6 class in December, helping them write their first mystery story, which was really cool.
And how are you promoting yourself to the schools? And did they just come and find you?
No. I go out and find them. So usually it's like what you talked about, which is you talk to a friend who talks to a friend, right? So my first school visit was with my son's school, which makes sense because that's who I had an invite to. But then that teacher spoke to another teacher and they invited me, and then that teacher talked to another teacher. So I probably have about 10 schools in local Toronto who have me on their roster to come by once a year, which is great because it's really draining. I find teachers visits and school visits way more draining than most of the other events because you're on all the time and you want to be like so encouraging to these kids. So you're like constantly like at a high level. And by the time you get home, you're like, oh my God, I need to lie down. Like it's hard to maintain.
Well, you'll probably find yourself to be extremely exhausted every day of book week then. When you finish book week, you'll probably sleep for a month after. But the book's coming out soon, the 3rd book, so that's great. We'll wish you all the success with that. It's been wonderful to have you on here, and I'm hoping that people will watch this video and be interested to find out more about you and the books and everything. So thank you very much for being here, and we wish you all the success with the 3rd installment of Portia Adams.
Thank you so much, Simon. I appreciate it.